Ladies and gentlemen, this is Protecting Elections Part 2, Other Culprits, Why Judges and the Media Refuse to Look at the Evidence. Please welcome, from the Binnall Law Group, Jesse Binnall, Fox News contributor Deroy Murdock, from the Heritage Foundation, Hans von Spakovsky, and our moderator from the American Conservative Union Foundation, Denise Cohen.
We over here? Go.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
And Deroy, thank you so much for setting us up.
Pleasure.
Deroy is a fellow New Yorker. Like me, we both escaped for a couple of days. Jesse Binnall is a litigator out of Alexandria, Virginia, and he went to Nevada for 5 days to fight for President Trump and came back 2 months later. Had some interesting experiences. And Hans von Spakovsky with the Heritage Foundation has been writing for them on election integrity for many, many years, and he has always been proven right. So, Deroy set it up for us perfectly. If we had actually followed those principles, we wouldn't be sitting here today talking about an election that none of us can wrap our heads around. And we're going to talk about the how, but before we do, let's find out what happened. Why didn't the judges, why didn't the media, why didn't they look at all this evidence that was collecting everywhere? What do you, louder? It's a good crowd, okay.
You want to hear what we have to say?
All right, or turn the mic up. So what do you think, guys? Hans, what do you think? Why do you think the judges didn't look at the evidence?
Well, it's very interesting because, judges in even ordinary election contests are very reluctant to overturn an election. And when it becomes an extraordinary election contest, one with national implications and one in which they risk being attacked by one of the political parties, the pundits, and the news media, their reluctance to do anything gets even greater. And that's why if you look at almost all the cases that were filed after the November election, virtually all of them were dismissed on procedural grounds.
So we're going to get into that, but I mean, are you saying that the judges were afraid that they didn't want to look at the evidence?
Well, I think in some cases that is true. In other cases, they might have had valid procedural grounds, but it sure didn't look like it to me. I mean, the best example of that is one Pennsylvania case was dismissed for the doctrine of latches, which is this legal doctrine that says, well, you can't wait to assert a claim. You can't sit on your rights. Well, the election had just happened, and they filed suit very quickly after that, so applying that doctrine just did not seem legally correct.
Yeah, that was... Why do you think the judges didn't look at?
Well, Hans von Spakovsky is always right. He's right again today. I think the judges didn't want to get involved. I think essentially they didn't do their jobs. And I think it's a bit like, imagine you're watching Game 7 of the World Series. It's the bottom of the ninth. Teams are tied. Bases are loaded. And the runner on third base tries to steal home, dives into home base. He reaches home base at the same time that the catcher touches him with his mitt. Everybody's wondering, is he safe? Is he out? Everyone looks at the home plate umpire and goes, why are you looking at me? I don't want to get involved. He turns around and walks out the door, all right? So what happens? Rather than either make a good call or a bad call, but at least make a call, he doesn't make a call. And what happens? The fans in the stands start fighting with each other, and chaos ensues. The Supreme Court did this when they did not get involved in the Texas case. They should have heard the case. They should have heard the evidence. I think even if they'd heard the evidence, even if they made a decision with which we disagree, we all would be able to say, well, at least we had our day in court. They said, whatever, we don't want to get involved. No, they should have got involved. That's their jobs. Their job is to get involved in the tough cases, not the easy cases, the tough cases, and give us a ruling, and they didn't. And it's to their profound discredit that they didn't do so, and largely, I think, bear a lot of the responsibility for the chaos that ensued.
And that's continuing, right? That's continuing because just last week the Supreme Court... It's continuing because just last week the Supreme Court said they weren't going to look at a whole bunch of other cases.
And again, they're
so
not...
it's going to remain unresolved.
Yeah, what's the excuse now? They don't want to get involved, so next election we're going to deal with this again. They need to get in.
Well,
I hope they make decisions we like, but even if they don't make decisions we dislike, at least we'll know what the rules are. We can proceed rather
need to
than
know
just
the rules are.
operate in a fog.
Jesse, you had some thoughts about the judges
I do. I think both of those are excellent points why this happened, but there's another aspect of it too, and that is that actually judges, technically speaking, are human beings. And I understand that they were also lawyers at one point in their career, but when they're serving as judges, they're also human beings. And when you have judges that are doing these, taking on these cases, they're also going home and they're watching the media. So when the media has this narrative that there is no voter fraud, that it's debunked, it's baseless, and they say the same thing over and over and over again in one of the most enraging but successful gaslighting attempts in American history, judges are actually at home watching that. And they don't want to be the first one to go out there and say that the emperor has no clothes. Right. And so you get in this circle of disinformation where the media starts the lie. You know, our friends right there in the media, a lot of them, they start the lie that there's no voter fraud, and they start saying baseless without any basis for saying that it's baseless. Exactly. And then judges go ahead and base their decisions on that, and then the media comes back and points to the judges who are really already doing what the media tells them to do in a lot of cases, saying, see, judges are agreeing with them. So it's a circle of disinformation.
Yeah, and so they're creating a story, but they're not actually investigating either, right? But the media is not actually investigating the situation either. It's
incredible. They have completely abdicated their roles to be the fourth estate and to go out there and try to, be gumshoes and get to the bottom of this by saying, actually, let's look at this evidence. Let's look at this, the huge amount of data that we had in Nevada, for instance, to actually see whether or not it's accurate. They never dug into any of that. They, right or wrong, they never tried to dig into the facts about voter fraud. They just said it doesn't exist.
Right.
And I can give an example of this. To show how things have changed in the media. Look, we're in Florida, right? We're in Orlando, okay? Well, in 1997, there was a mayor's race in Miami, okay? There were all these stories and claims that fraud may have occurred in that election. So the Miami Herald actually assigned a huge group of reporters to investigate the case. They went out, they interviewed witnesses, they interviewed voters, and they uncovered a voter fraud conspiracy that ended up in court. A judge overturned the election, said there were probably at least 5,000 fraudulent ballots cast in that election. Dozens of individuals were indicted, criminally charged, and convicted, and the Miami Herald won a Pulitzer Prize for its work. Okay? You didn't see that same kind of activity after this last election, and in fact, last fall, before the election, USA Today, PBS Frontline, assigned more than a dozen reporters to investigate me and the election fraud database that we maintain at the Heritage Foundation, which has over 1,300 proven cases of fraud. And what were the reporters doing? Going through our database, case by case by case, trying to find a mistake, rather than actually going out and investigating the kind of claims Jesse is talking about, where you go interview the witnesses and see what their credibility is and what their stories are.
Right.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, one of my huge frustrations as a Fox News contributor and someone who's on TV and on radio is hearing these, my brethren in the media say, oh, there's no evidence of vote fraud. It got to the point where I would go on television, and I wrote about a dozen articles about vote fraud in addition to the TV and radio appearances I did. And I put one article in a file and another, until I had probably a stack about that big, 4 folders, 4 files like this. And I'd go on there and say, oh, no evidence? Well, then, please explain all this stuff. Affidavits, courtroom transcripts, courtroom pleadings by Jesse, as a matter of fact, statistical anomalies, letters from legislators and so on. There was evidence. Now, you can weigh some evidence more than others or question some evidence, but the idea that there is no evidence was a total, complete lie, but they repeated it over and over and over again until people believed, oh, there's no evidence, it's just all of us hallucinating up here.
Well, and in fact, it seems that there was only one case out of all of this litigation that we've seen where there may have been a tiny little bit of evidence that did go forward, and that was in Nevada, and it wasn't covered that much, perhaps because there was some evidence. But you were saying that your procedural rights were kind of interfered with just in the way that the case was conducted. You weren't given, the opportunities that you normally would.
That's absolutely right. Our legs were cut off before we even walked into the courthouse. We were told that we had to prove our entire case for election fraud with no more than 15 witnesses, that we would have to put all this together during the Thanksgiving holiday, and so if we couldn't get witnesses to show up, then we wouldn't be able to substitute in one witness for another. It would all be by deposition, no live testimony, and we were given no meaningful opportunity to actually go out there and prove our case. We had 30 witnesses that were ready to go, and half of our witnesses were taken away from us at the very first status conference in the case. When it came to our appeal, the Supreme Court of Nevada gave us slightly over 2 hours to file our appellate brief. 2 hours. Normally, that's something that you get at least months for. An election case is going to be truncated, we understand that, but they gave us slightly over 2 hours. In slightly over 2 hours, we still, with a great team, still put together a 40-page brief of all the problems in the district court.
So Jesse, in 2 hours, you were able to pull together a 40-page brief explaining everything, and I imagine it must have taken them quite some time to review the brief and come back to you with an opinion?
About 2 hours later, they came out with their opinion. I'm sure there was no chance that was written before we even filed our brief.
No chance at all.
Matter of fact, we know it is because one of the things they told us in the 2 hours is they wanted us to quote chapter and verse where in the district court record our errors were, because they figured there's no way in a couple hours that we could get that in there. But we did. And they had a part of their opinion that said that we didn't do it because they assumed that we wouldn't be able to do it.
And now, that was the only case where there was any kind of evidence. So we go back to all of the rest, all of the hundreds of cases that didn't go forward, and they were dismissed on what are procedural grounds? Who?
Standing? I guess standing was a big, you don't have
So
standing.
what is standing? What is standing?
Well, I'm not a lawyer. Maybe one of the attorneys.
You're the best person to answer
Well,
it then.
I mean, with standing, you have to show that you have a concrete injury. You're not just speculating that you might have been injured or perhaps you'll be injured, and many of the cases were dismissed on that ground. Look, the key point here is the credibility of all of these claims was never really investigated. And that's something that you should do and have to do. And since the courts didn't do it, frankly, it's now up to the state legislatures to do this. They are in session all over the country, and they should be doing it.
And if correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Georgia has a GOP state legislature. I believe Pennsylvania does as well. I think not both houses in various states, but one house or the other. So you could have, as you say, state legislative investigations, hearings, where they finally can get to the evidence, get the stuff out there. Obviously, it's too late to do anything about the 2020 election, but at least we can know what happened and act accordingly.
It really is quite remarkable because there are, how much evidence do you think there is that's accumulating in boxes around the country? All of these public records.
Well,
How much do you think there
it may be
is?
shredded by now.
Yeah.
You think so?
Maybe, well, probably.
Well, look, they're supposed
possibly.
to keep them.
Because what?
They don't always keep them. They're supposed to keep them, but it's unfortunately far too common for a lot of these local officials to maybe not keep up with their document retention requirements because in many cases they know about the voter fraud, but they're unfortunately looking out for their own necks, and they're perhaps not that concerned about the voter fraud because they know that the voter fraud is going their direction. And so they have no real incentive to keep up with their document retention policies. But we do need to do that, and it's absolutely critical that state legislatures start doing their jobs like they've said. But the other thing that we need to start doing is what the Democrats have been doing for a very long time, and that is understanding that these cases aren't won in the days, weeks after an election. They're won in the weeks, months, and even years before elections. So when we litigate these cases now, we need to try to get ahead of it. We can't just be playing defense. We need to go on the offense. We need to go in there and say, we have constitutional rights at issues to make sure that there's not voter disenfranchisement through fraud. Because every single time that a fraudulent vote is counted, the vote of an honest citizen is dead. It's canceled out. And the media is ignoring that message. They say what we're doing is voter suppression. When they're suppressing the real speech on this issue, that's the real suppression, and that's the real voter disenfranchisement that's happening.
Well, ironically, they ignore the voter suppression. And in fact, my brother was watching CNN this morning. And they were talking about this panel, about Deroy's panel, about all the stuff that we're doing on election integrity. And they said it was just a bunch of voter suppression.
But see, it's the opposite of that. Let me give you a quick example again, okay? Shortly before the election, I actually published a paper at the Heritage Foundation. There was a study of 4 proven absentee ballot fraud cases from across the country, including that Miami mayor's race that I talked about, and in which elections were overturned because of the fraud. And let me tell you what the common factor was in almost all of those cases. The people engaging in the fraud, stealing the election, submitting fraudulent ballots, who do you think they picked on? What they picked on was the most vulnerable populations. They were going after, as they said in the Indiana case, the elderly, people for whom English is not the first language, folks who are voting for the first time. They were going after the poor and the people who wouldn't know that what's going on is wrong, who wouldn't complain about it. So those are the populations who are picked on by the folks who want to steal elections.
You know, Hans is right about that, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there's a case not too long ago where some folks actually were caught trying to get homeless people to vote, and the way they were doing it was giving them cigarettes.
Yes.
Is that right? I mean, this is from people who probably say, oh, big tobacco is awful. Here they are giving cigarettes to homeless people so they can put them on buses and take them to go vote. This is ugly, disgusting behavior. And by the way, I think one thing that would help a lot, has not come up yet, but I go through very often have gone through the excellent database that Hans and his team have put together at the Heritage Foundation. And you can read the specifics on these cases, the location, the dates, the circumstances, and the punishments. And almost always what you see is probation, suspended sentence, small fine, oh, don't do that again. This is going to keep going unless we start putting people in jail, locking them up behind bars, and when people see...
You know what, Troy, I'm going to...
When fraudulent political actors find themselves behind bars, not for a week or two, but I'm talking months and years, then maybe this will start tapering off. Right now, there's no disincentive to do it. Why not steal an election? You know, maybe you'll have to, do a little community service or something.
This is an
issue. I won't
issue.
be caught.
Is it stolen, or was it that the laws were weakened so much leading into the election that there was plenty of room for error? And it's very hard to distinguish between when people are innocently making mistakes and their votes, which should not be counted, are being counted. And that's the kind of thing that we would have discovered had we actually taken a look at the evidence. It's not necessarily the most nefarious thing that people are looking at. It could be just human error that was sufficient enough. Maybe. But we haven't looked at the evidence, so this is the point. We don't know, and that's the major frustration here.
That's an excellent point. It is an excellent point. There is some mistakes that were truly human error. There were irregularities that were human error. There's, perhaps people that didn't know that they couldn't vote once they've moved to a new state. I don't know. There's certain instances of that. But in Nevada, we introduced evidence of 42,000 double votes or multiple votes. That's not an accident. Most people know that in this country we have one person and one vote. And the failure to even look at that evidence and also look at the irregularities and the fact that we have these laws And these, in Nevada, there was a law called AB4 that was passed in the dead of night just months before the election, for instance, that set the groundwork for voter fraud, that set the groundwork for irregularities, that set it for all of this. And lo and behold, the stage was set, and the fraud and the irregularities came.
Now, you testified to this in the U.S. Senate, didn't you?
I did.
Did everybody see it on YouTube?
I'm sorry?
Did everybody see it on YouTube?
YouTube took down my sworn Senate testimony before the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs because it talked about voter fraud. They took it down. That is one of the incredible examples of the suppression of speech that we've gotten right now, and where you have not just the traditional media, but you have these social media outlets that are trying to absolutely silence this discussion, this debate that we're having. The traditional media is no better. USA Today tried to fact-check our case in Nevada. And the way they did it is they went and got a data scientist, because we had extremely compelling data that still has never been rebutted, only ignored. And USA Today got this data scientist to say, oh, they didn't, the data evidence didn't show which reports and data it was looking at. That's just absolutely wrong. It was in the expert report, and our expert was deposed in cross-examination by one of the main partners at Perkins Coie. It is hogwash to say that we didn't give him that information. And the next thing that USA Today, the fact checker, did was read the court's opinion and say, well, the court disagreed with this, so it must be false. Again, we get back into this circle of disinformation.
You mentioned mistakes. There are mistakes. People sometimes do something innocently, which they shouldn't do. But we have affidavits. Affidavits are evidence. This is among the evidence that the media refused to read were all these affidavits. So I think about 1,000 by people who saw things that they thought were funny, unusual, illegal, as the case may be. I was fascinated by some affidavits out of Georgia by election observers, including a couple of Democrats who said that they saw these ballots for Biden, absentee ballots. Absentee ballots leave the registrar of voters. They fold them, they put them in envelopes, you fill them out, you fold them again, you mail them back. So they have fold marks. Well, these absentee ballots, according to these affidavits, did not have fold marks. They were never folded. And they had votes for Biden and nothing else, nobody voting for House or Congress or City Council, what have you. And the bubbles where you fill in Biden were all pristine, all completely, perfectly filled in and identical, as if done by a machine or something like that. That to me is unusual. That to me sounds pretty illegal. And I think at a minimum, we should have had an investigation of that and seen, was this on the up and up or was this corrupt?
Why did that evidence not go forward? What happened there? What did that get thrown out?
It didn't go forward. I think you guys can correct me on this, but I believe the judges who saw it in Georgia said, oh, well, we're not going to rule on this, and the case was dismissed.
And I'll give you another example in our case on that, is we were able to get in the discovery period, the 4-day discovery period we had in Nevada, evidence of over 4,000 undocumented immigrants voting in Nevada.
Discovery where you get the other people to turn over the information that you're looking for so that you can...
That's right. And because we didn't turn it over before we had it, the judge wouldn't accept it. The judge wouldn't accept our affidavit evidence after limiting us to 15 witnesses. We tried to get in other witnesses through affidavits because that's all we could do, and the judge wouldn't accept that at all either.
What this demonstrates is, look, it is really difficult to prove fraud after an election because you have only a short period of time. It's hard and difficult to gather the evidence, takes a lot of time and resources. And what all of this illustrates is you want to be sure that it doesn't happen in the first place.
Yes.
And the only way that's going to happen, is two things that have to be done right now. Okay, one of them is stopping, as Deroy was talking about, H.R. 1, which is coming down the pike this week. Okay, which will basically put in the worst rules you can imagine in all the states and will ban states from having basic security protocols like voter ID laws. But the second thing is getting the state legislatures right now while they're in session to fix all of these problems and all of these issues and doing just basic common sense things like putting in voter ID laws that apply to both in-person and absentee balloting.
You know, one of the things that's difficult about H.R. 1 that's coming to the floor of the House next week, and it's designed to federalize all election law, which is really designed to be run by the state legislatures. Has to be run by the states, agreed, per the Constitution. So,
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The Constitution says that the election laws are supposed to be governed by the states. H.R. 1
correct.
says,
So H.R. 1 is an
Constitution, whatever, we're going to do our own thing, which is sort of their outlook on a lot of things.
Here's the reason that this is so difficult to swallow is this election actually was lost very closely. The Washington Post reported that fewer than 45,000 votes would have swung it in a different direction across 3 different states. 3 different states, 42,000 votes, 45,000 votes, something like that, and we would have had an electoral college vote of 269 to 269. Back then, Republicans had the majority in the House of Representatives. They would have voted, and President Trump would have had a second term, and something like H.R. 1 would not be able to go through. There are going to be many consequences that we're facing because such a close election was lost. And with all of these efforts from the media, from the judges, from the left, all of these efforts still came to a very close race.
Yeah. But that's why these kind of state law provisions can make a difference. And again, if I can just go back to it very quickly, to show what a difference it could make, H.R. 1 bans all state voter ID laws at the very same time that it requires all states to put in same-day voter registration. You understand what that means? That means that I could walk into any polling place on Election Day, say that my name is not Hans von Spakovsky, but Tom Swift, and I live at 100 Main Street. They have to register me and immediately let me vote, and they can't ask me for an ID to verify who I am that actually live in that area. I could then leave that polling place and go to the next polling place down the street, immediately register under the name Tom Smith, vote, and keep doing it all day, and there's absolutely nothing state officials could do to stop it if H.R. 1 is passed.
And, well, we're going to stop. We have to fight. At the end of this session, we'll be forcing out to your apps a means for you to contact your legislator. You'll put in some information, and you'll be able to send them a letter telling them to vote against it. And our goal really is that not a single Republican in the House votes for this thing. We need to have a unified front to fight it. It's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge, and
Yeah, well, it will be a challenge, but look, I mean, we need to fight on this one, and I think this is probably going to go down to a party line vote. I don't know if we can peel away any of the Democrats in the Senate on this, but we all ought to be talking to everyone who know. Contact your lawmakers, contact your friends, call radio stations, go on local television, whatever access to the media you have, and just scream bloody murder about this thing, because if this goes through, all the garbage we saw last November is going to be baked into the U.S. code.
Yeah. And look, this actually, there should be a bipartisan effort in the states to stop this, because I don't care whether you're a Republican state legislator or a Democratic state legislator, you ought to be angry at the idea that Washington is going to usurp your role and tell you how to run elections in your state. The residents of that state, through their elected representatives, are the ones who make that decision. H.R. 1, I think, is the most anti-democratic bill I've seen in my 20 years in Washington.
That says a lot.
it does say
And they call it, what, the For the People Act, right?
Right.
We call it the Not For the People Act. It's Orwellian bill names.
So we're going to wrap it up pretty quickly, and just what is one of the most egregious things that you think happened in this last election cycle that caused us to be where we are today?
Absentee ballots Look, nobody disputes that we need them for people who are in the military and overseas, or for people who are so physically disabled they can't make it to the polling place. But other than that, we should all be voting in person. And the biggest mistake that was made in the last election, in addition to the fact that voter rolls are in notoriously bad shape around the country, is that there was this huge push to go to absentee ballots. COVID-19 was used as an excuse, even though all of us are safely going to our grocery stores and our pharmacies. And the whole problem with absentee ballots is this. They're the only kind of ballot that are voted outside the supervision of election officials and outside the observation of poll watchers. And that makes them the most vulnerable to being altered, changed, forged, and it makes voters vulnerable in their homes to pressure and coercion to vote a particular way. And that is the whole problem with them. And I think that was the biggest problem with this past election.
I'll pick up on something Hans said. Hillary Clinton said one of the reasons that she lost the election in 2016 was that the pro-Trump husbands were forcing their pro-Hillary wives to vote for Trump, okay? And we all laughed at that. And it sounds like yet another of her 1,000 excuses as to why what happened happened. But there probably are instances where you've got a very abusive spouse. It could be the wife beating up the husband, or the husband beating up the wife, as the case may be. Or it could be, okay, Grandpa, if you don't vote the way we want, you're not going to get your insulin this afternoon, or whatever else it is. Now, if you have that kind of pressure, you can go to the polls, vote the way you want, and then come out and tell your obnoxious relatives, hey, I voted the way you wanted, when in fact you didn't. But if you've got an absentee ballot, you're sitting at the kitchen table and they're watching you fill it out, and they're going to pick it up and drop it off at the drop-off box a couple blocks away, you're now voting for a candidate you don't want to support. So this is an additional problem, and why we need to stop these absentee ballots. The other thing I'd add very briefly is there's something beautiful, I think, about the way we used to vote, which is we show up on Election Day, you go to the local firehouse, the local schoolroom, whatever it is, and we, the American people, on one day in November, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, decide who our leaders will be. And there's something very moving and touching. And then they count the ballots, and about midnight or so, we know who's going to govern us, and the people we've given the consent to govern us. Now you sit at home, you're voting in a bathrobe or the towel around your waist, whatever it is, while you're watching Jimmy Kimmel or whatever's going on. And then you drop it off at some drop box. Who knows if it's ever going to get picked up or if it's blended in with fraudulent ballots. And what they've basically done is dumb down elections. So you've got the fraud problem and just this destruction of this beautiful civic ritual of the American people coming together to have democratic elections or constitutional republic. I think we need to go back to the old model.
We have to have transparency.
Sorry?
We have to have transparency. That is one of the most important lessons that I think we get out of the 2020 election. That, hey, maybe the Washington Post is onto something, and democracy does die in darkness. Because the kind of darkness we had in 2020 was tons and tons of examples where there was no transparency in the way that votes were being cast and the way that votes were being counted.
Right.
And that observers were shunned, weren't given meaningful access. There were tons of time where election officials were alone with ballots, which is a horrible, horrible idea. Yeah. We had evidence in Nevada where postal workers were told by their supervisors they had to deliver ballots to undeliverable addresses. And then when we tried to subpoena those postal workers, the Postal Service said, nope, they can't come to court. We're not going to let you not even come to court. You can't even take a deposition of them. We have to have transparency. We have to make sure that, like we say, the mail-in voting is just ripe for fraud. The rest of the world almost exclusively does voting in person because of the opportunities for fraud in mail-in voting. And we're supposed to be the gold standard. We have to put a stop in this, and making sure there's transparency in the future is one of the most important things we can do.
There are many things that we have to do, and Deroy had a great list of them. The American Conservative Union is going to be launching a Center to Protect Elections, and we're going to be counting on everybody here to join us to be activists to fight. We'll be talking more about it towards the end of the election, the end of the conference. But again, please look at your phones and do your part right now to fight H.R. 1 and make sure that we do everything we can to defeat this bill because it's going to be that much harder for us to ever have another Republican elected if we lose it. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, CPAC Nation. Democrat John F. Kennedy liked to joke during the 1960 presidential campaign that he just opened a telegram from his father. It read, "Dear Jack, don't buy one more vote than necessary. I'll be damned if I pay for a landslide." Republican Bob Dole said in 1996, "When I die, I want to be buried in Chicago so I can stay active in politics." These lines get a chuckle or two these days, but especially after the November 2020 election fiasco, vote fraud is no laughing matter. CPAC's theme is America Uncanceled. A keystone of the right's new agenda absolutely, positively must be to uncancel election integrity. Why are clean elections vital? Why must Republicans and Democrats both be able to say after Election Day, yep, that was a fair vote? Election integrity is a core principle that undergirds this constitutional republic that you and I love so much. In 1787, James Madison emphasized the importance of elections in Federalist Paper number 52. And as he wrote, "It is essential to liberty that the government in general should have an immediate dependence on and an intimate sympathy with the people. Frequent elections are unquestionably the only policy by which this dependence and sympathy can be effectually secured. Our republic relies on democratic elections to implement a basic tenet on which this nation stands." Thomas Jefferson wrote this in America's birth certificate, our Declaration of Independence. To secure the rights endowed by our Creator, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Through elections, we give our representatives our consent to be governed. Absent this consent, our founding fathers believed, government is illegitimate. Furthermore, since all men are created equal, our elections should empower one man with one vote. These words were taken quite literally for 144 years. Eventually, in 1920, we embraced the concept of one woman, one vote. And with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we finally abolished the idea that one had to be white to vote. This proves for all the consulistas and wokistanis out there that America is not perfect, and we have made mistakes along the way, some of them huge, but we always try to do better. And sooner or later, either we get it right, or at least we do it better than damn near any place else on this planet. So in short, election integrity matters. Battle elections are essential to the good health of this republic as checks and balances, the rule of law, and liberty and justice for all. Alas, this guiding concept is in huge trouble these days. Despite the left's relentless lies, vote fraud is a problem. For concrete proof, check the Heritage Foundation's priceless vote fraud database. Heritage Foundation has detailed so far 1,130 criminal convictions for vote fraud. No, not accusations, not indictments, but criminal convictions, 1,130 of them. So don't tell me that vote fraud is just some right-wing hallucination. The November 2020 election was a nightmare. Judges and other officials made last-minute rule changes that only state legislators were authorized to enact, as the U.S. Constitution requires. Mysterious late-night ballot dumps triggered huge lopsided vote spikes for Joe Biden. Multiple affidavits offered sworn eyewitness reports of cars with out-of-state license plates unloading piles of ballots at counting centers in the wee small hours. Such shenanigans and many more infected Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. No wonder a November 18 Reuters survey found that 39% of Americans believe, quote, the election was rigged, unquote. This included 67% of Republicans, 31% of independents, and even 17% of Democrats. Willfully blind leftists ridicule the right's complaints about fake ballots and election irregularities because they were not widespread. Well, how widespread must vote fraud be before the left shares our concerns? Will that require 10,000 bogus ballots? 1 million phony votes? Here's a modest proposal. The left can pick that widespread number. We on the right will accept it. And in turn, the right will decide which leftists will have their genuine votes canceled by those widespread fraudulent ballots. Let's start with Rachel Maddow, Chuck Todd, Joy Reid, Chris Cuomo, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer. If illegal ballots nullify their votes, maybe they finally will fight for election integrity. Of course, that is unlikely because the Democrat Party is the party of vote fraud. Yes, this is quite a charge, but abundant evidence confirms this allegation. Democrats resist virtually every Republican idea to make our elections more secure, and they labor tirelessly to make our elections more chaotic, more unsupervised, and more unreliable. Democrats, not Republicans, blasted out mass mail-in ballots to everyone on voter rolls in multiple states, whether requested or not. Phantom ballots littered apartment building lobbies. Some were thrown in the trash. How many of them were filled out and submitted? Who knows? Democrats, not Republicans, installed ballot drop boxes on sidewalks where nobody oversaw them. How many fraudulent ballots got deposited in these boxes unchecked and then got counted? Who knows? Democrats, not Republicans, diluted signature match standards, which made it easier to accept and tabulate mail-in ballots with forged signatures. Democrats, not Republicans, blocked GOP observers from ballot counting rooms in Atlanta, Detroit, Philadelphia, and other Democrat swing state cities. In contrast, Democrat observers did their jobs in peace in Republican-controlled areas. Virginia lawmakers passed a sensible bill in 2017 that would have required an investigation of any election in which there were more ballots cast than eligible voters to cast them. Well, guess what? Former Governor Terry McAuliffe, a Democrat, not a Republican, vetoed that measure. The Federal Motor Voter Act and Help America Vote Act both require that states maintain accurate voter rolls. Here in Florida, former Governor Rick Scott attempted to remove 51,000 dead people from the voter rolls. Not so fast. Obama's Attorney General Eric Holder, a Democrat, not a Republican, sued Florida. Holder claimed that the governor's act of electoral hygiene violated the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And now Democrats, not Republicans, are pushing H.R. 1, a bill that would take everything that went haywire last November and shove it into the U.S. Code. As Nancy Reagan might have said, just say no to H.R. 1. We will underscore election integrity's crucial importance via multiple panels throughout CPAC, starting with our very next session. Please join us for these urgent discussions. Speaking of conservative political action, long before the 2022 midterm elections, conservatives should demand at a minimum the following reforms. First, as Ronald Reagan might have said, we must catapult mass mail-in ballots onto the ash heap of history. Second, absentee ballots must be limited to the old, the sick, the infirm, and what a concept, people who will be absent on Election Day. Third, Election Day must be Election Day, not election month or election quarter. Fourth, no more ballot harvesting. Fifth, voters must be American citizens, not foreign citizens. Sixth, voter rolls must be cleaned early and often to remove inactive, relocated, and deceased voters. Let's remember and honor our dead, but let's keep them away from the polls, shall we? Seventh, when voters cast ballots, they must show photo ID that proves they are who they say they are. Now the left calls us racist for expecting black voters like everyone else to show ID cards. Wrong. What is racist is the Democrats' insistence that we blacks are too disorganized, too confused, or too stupid to get our hands on photo ID cards. What bigoted anti-black filth. Black Americans show photo ID 7 days a week to drive cars, cash checks, purchase adult beverages, and much more. Just yesterday, the federal government under Joe Biden made me show photo ID to board my jet to Orlando, just like everyone else. How racist. Now, if voter ID really is a tool of white nationalism, how does the left explain this? Nigeria, a country that is controlled by black people. If you want to vote, you got to show voter ID. Ghana, a country that is controlled by black people. If you want to vote, you got to show voter ID. And here is the situation in South Africa. Here is the late, great Nelson Mandela wearing a t-shirt that says, "Get an ID, register, vote." So yes, we want voter ID cards, and we want them now. Voter ID cards are good enough for Nelson Mandela, so they're good enough for the USA. The fight for clean elections will be huge in the months and years ahead, and we all need to fight like hell for election integrity. This is a fight we can and must win. If we lose, we will become the corruptly outvoted vassals of the left. It is in our hands, my fellow conservatives, to make elections great again. Thank you very much. Thank you.